Daniel Mercer was not the kind of man who liked attention. He lived quietly in a middle-class neighborhood in suburban Texas, in a modest but well-kept house with his two teenage kids, Emily, 16, and Jake, 14. His wife had left the family a year ago, and since then, Daniel had taken on both roles, father and mother. He worked hard, made sure the kids got to school on time, helped them with homework, and cooked dinner almost every night. But Daniel wasn't just any dad. He was a federal judge, a respected one at that. But he kept that part of his life private. He didn't want special treatment, and more importantly, he wanted his children to grow up without labels or pressure. So when people asked what he did for a living, he'd say something vague like, "I work in law." Most people assumed he was a lawyer or maybe a legal consultant, not someone who wore the black robe in federal courtrooms across the country. Their neighborhood was quiet, friendly, and peaceful. At least, it used to be. The trouble started with the HOA. HOA stands for Homeowners Association, which is basically a group of neighbors who make rules about how everyone should live. They decide what color your fence can be, whether you can park on the street, or if your grass is too tall. In theory, HOAs are meant to keep neighborhoods clean and safe. But sometimes they go too far. And this particular HOA had gone rogue. It all began with small things. Emily and Jake were teenagers after all. Sometimes their bikes were left outside. Sometimes the trash cans weren't put away quickly enough. Once, Jake accidentally let the dog out, and it ran through the neighbor's yard. Nothing serious, nothing worth going to war over. But the HOA president, Linda Carmichael, saw these as personal attacks. Linda was a retired school teacher with a sharp tongue and an even sharper sense of control. She believed the HOA had absolute authority over every inch of property, even inside homes if she thought something was wrong. She had been known to call the city code enforcement office over minor issues, and she took pride in being the neighborhood watchdog. When she first noticed the Mercer home wasn't following some of the rules, she sent a polite letter. Then another. Then came the fines. At first, Daniel ignored them. He figured they were mistakes or misunderstandings. But soon the letters turned into threats. $50 here, $100 there, for parking the car on the driveway, for letting the leaves pile up near the sidewalk, for loud music during what Linda claimed was quiet hours. Daniel finally decided to respond. He wrote a calm, respectful email asking for a meeting so they could talk things out. He offered to fix whatever needed fixing. But instead of a response, he got silence, and then more fines. Then came the harassment. Linda started posting on the neighborhood Facebook group, calling him a rule breaker and bad influence. Some neighbors agreed. Others stayed quiet, afraid of becoming targets themselves. One day, Daniel found a note taped to his front door that said, "Some people think they're above the law. We know better." That's when things got personal. He tried to stay cool. He knew the system. He knew how to fight back. But he also knew that once people start feeling powerful, they don't stop easily. Still, Daniel didn't want to drag his kids into it. He wanted them to have a normal life, not become part of a neighborhood war. So he did what any reasonable person would do. He hired a lawyer. His attorney reached out to the HOA board, asking them to stop the harassment and explains the fines. But Linda refused to back down. She saw Daniel's lawyer as a threat, and worse, a challenge to her authority. She doubled down. Soon, the HOA started sending emails to other neighbors warning them about Daniel. They claimed he was dangerous, that he had threatened board members, he hadn't, and that he might be neglecting his kids. Rumors spread like wildfire. Emily came home crying one day because a classmate had told her, "My mom says your dad's a criminal." Jake started skipping meals and acting withdrawn. Daniel had seen courtroom battles. He had dealt with criminals and liars. But this was different. This was personal. and it was happening in his own backyard. He went to the next HOA meeting, hoping to clear the air. He stood up in front of the room, composed and calm, and said, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to raise my kids in peace. I've always followed the law, and I'll continue to do so, but I won't let anyone attack me or my children unfairly." No one clapped. Linda glared at him like he had insulted her personally. After the meeting, she pulled him aside and whispered, "You may think you're smarter than us, Mr. Mercer, but around here we take care of our own. And rule breakers? They don't last long." That was the last straw. Daniel knew then that Linda wasn't going to stop. She had become obsessed with punishing him. And now she wasn't just targeting him. She was going after his kids. He started documenting everything. Emails, text messages, photos of the house, videos of HOA members watching his home from across the street. He filed a complaint with the city council and contacted the local newspaper anonymously, hoping someone would listen. But no one did, until the worst happened. One afternoon, Daniel came home late from work. He had stayed late at the courthouse helping a friend with a case. As he walked into the house, he expected to hear the usual sounds. The TV on, the kids arguing over video games, maybe the sound of the microwave beeping. But it was silent. Too silent. He called out, "Hey kids, I'm home." No answer. He checked the kitchen, the living room, upstairs bedrooms. Empty. His heart sank. He grabbed his phone and called Emily's number. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. Same with Jake. He called the school. Emily had left early. With someone from social services, they said. Jake had never shown up that morning. Panic hit him like a wave. He rushed to the police station. They looked confused. "We didn't get a missing persons report." "I didn't file one," he snapped, "because I don't know where my kids are." An officer finally ran a search. "Sir, your kids were taken by Child Protective Services earlier today." "What? On what grounds?" "They received a tip from the HOA," the officer said nervously, "about child endangerment, neglect, unsafe conditions." "That's a lie," Daniel shouted, but the damage was done. His children were gone. Taken. And the only reason was because he had dared to stand up to a power-hungry HOA president who had gone too far. Now Daniel had a choice. He could cry. He could beg. Or he could fight. And Daniel Mercer? He always fought. Not just for himself, but for his kids. And now the world was about to find out who he really was. Daniel's hands shook as he tried to dial his lawyer. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. His kids were gone, taken by social services, based on lies from the HOA. He had heard stories like this before. People losing their children over false accusations, bad neighbors, or revenge. But never did he think it would happen to him. Not to a federal judge. Not to someone who spent his life upholding the law. But here he was, standing outside the police station, cold wind blowing, trying not to fall apart. The officer handed him a piece of paper with the name and number of the caseworker assigned to his kid's removal. "They said they got a call from the HOA," the officer repeated. "Claimed there was evidence of neglect." "What kind of evidence?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Broken appliances, unhealthy food, kids acting out. One neighbor even said she saw trash piled up near your door." "That's ridiculous," Daniel snapped. "We had pizza boxes from Friday night. That's not child abuse." "I believe you," the officer said gently. "But CPS has to act on reports like this. They'll hold them until a hearing." Daniel knew what that meant. In most cases, if a parent showed up at the emergency custody hearing with a lawyer, things could be cleared up quickly. But this wasn't just any case. This was personal. And Linda Carmichael, the HOA president, was behind it all. A father's desperation. Daniel drove straight to the Child Protective Services office. His mind raced with questions. Where were Emily and Jake? Were they scared? Did they know what was happening? He found the caseworker's office and knocked hard. A tired-looking woman opened the door. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Daniel said, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm Daniel Mercer. My kids were taken today. I need to see them." She looked at her notes. "Yes. We received a report from the neighborhood HOA. You're listed as the father." "Of course I am." Daniel said, "I'm their only parent. Where are they?" "They've been placed in temporary foster care," she explained, "pending investigation." Daniel felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Foster care? They weren't even being held at the agency. They were already in someone else's house. "Can I talk to them? Just for a minute?" "We can arrange a phone call," she said, typing something on her computer. "But not a visit yet." "How long will they be there?" "It depends on the court," she replied. "There's an emergency custody hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning." Tomorrow? That meant Emily and Jake would spend the night away from home. Away from him. Daniel left the office, feeling helpless. He called his lawyer again. "This is insane," he said when his attorney answered. "My kids have been taken based on a fake complaint from a power-hungry HOA president. I'll meet you at the courthouse first thing tomorrow," the lawyer said. "We'll fight this." But Daniel didn't want to wait. He needed to move fast. Digging up the truth. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table surrounded by papers, emails, screenshots, and legal documents. He printed out every email from the HOA, every fine, every threatening message from Linda Carmichael. He pulled up videos he had secretly recorded of board members watching his house from across the street. He even had footage of Linda talking to another neighbor about getting rid of troublemakers. He dug deeper into the HOA's records and found something shocking. They had targeted other families too. Single moms, elderly couples, young professionals, all had been harassed, fined, and in one case, forced to sell their homes after months of pressure. Linda wasn't just enforcing rules, she was running a campaign of fear. Daniel also found proof that Linda had sent multiple anonymous tips to local authorities about noise complaints, trash violations, and even fake reports of domestic violence. All of it pointed back to her. He printed everything. By morning, he had a full folder of evidence ready to present in court. The emergency custody hearing. The courtroom buzzed, with quiet tension the next morning, parents waiting nervously, lawyers flipping through paperwork, caseworkers whispering in corners. Daniel sat stiffly in the front row beside his lawyer. He wore a simple button-up shirt and slacks, no sign of his real job. Across the room sat Linda Carmichael and two other HOA board members. She looked smug, confident, like she had already won. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The hearing began. The caseworker gave a short summary of why the kids were removed. Then, Linda spoke. She described Daniel as a disruptive influence in the neighborhood, said he refused to follow basic rules, claimed he yelled at board members during meetings. Then came the worst part. She told the court that Daniel had been seen arguing with his kids late at night, that sometimes the lights stayed off for hours, that once she saw Emily crying on the porch. "He's not a good parent," Linda said firmly. "And frankly, we're lucky no one's been hurt." Daniel clenched his fists under the table. His lawyer stood up next. He calmly addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client is being unfairly targeted. These claims are not only exaggerated, they're completely false." He turned to Linda. "Did you personally witness any of these events?" "Well, no," she admitted, "but I heard from others." "Others?" the lawyer asked. "Are they here today?" No one raised their hand. Then the lawyer laid out the truth. He showed the judge the stack of HOA fines and threats, He played video clips of Linda spreading rumors online. He even presented a signed statement from another family who had been similarly targeted. Finally, he handed the judge a single page. It was Daniel's official government ID federal judge, Daniel Mercer. The courtroom went silent. Even the judge blinked twice, clearly stunned. "You're a federal judge?" the judge asked, looking directly at Daniel. Daniel stood up slowly. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "I've spent my life defending the law. And now, that same law was used to take my children from me. Because of a petty neighborhood feud." Gasps echoed through the room. Linda paled. The judge looked at the evidence again. At the lies. At the harassment. Then he made a decision. "Based on the information presented," the judge said, "the removal of these children appears to have been unjustified. I am ordering immediate reunification with Mr. Mercer." Daniel closed his eyes, in relief. His kids were coming home. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The beginning of a bigger fight. Later that day, Daniel picked up Emily and Jake from the foster home. They ran into his arms crying. "I thought we'd never see you again," Emily whispered. "I kept telling myself you'd come," Jake said, wiping his tears. "I always will," Daniel promised. Back home, he sat with them at the dinner table. "We're going to be okay," he said. "But we're not done fighting." Emily looked confused. "What do you mean?" "There are other families who went through this," Daniel said. "People who lost their homes, their kids, their peace. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again." Jake nodded slowly. "So, what now?" Daniel smiled. "Now," he said, "we go public." The courtroom was silent after the judge made his decision. Federal Judge Daniel Mercer stood tall, not with anger, but with purpose. He looked across the room at Linda Carmichael and the HOA board members who had tried to destroy his life. He saw fear in their eyes now. Not power, not control. Fear. The judge ordered the immediate return of Emily and Jake to their father's care. The foster agency was called, and within hours the kids were back home, safe and crying tears of joy in their dad's arms. But this wasn't over. Far from it. Daniel knew what had happened to him could happen to anyone, especially people without power, money, or influence. That's when he decided to take action. The story goes viral. By the next morning, the news broke online. Headlines screamed, "Father loses kids over HOA feud. Turns out he's a federal judge." Power hungry. HOA tries to take judge's kids. It backfires hard. How one neighborhood tried to destroy a family and failed. Local news stations picked up the story, then national ones. Reporters camped outside Daniel's house. News vans lined the street. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, shocked by everything they had just learned. Linda Carmichael, once the neighborhood queen bee, was suddenly public. Enemy number one. Social media exploded. People shared screenshots of her Facebook posts where she had called Daniel names. Others dug up old complaints from other families who had been targeted. Someone even created a hashtag, Justice for Mercer. And the world was watching. A town divided. In the days that followed, the town split into two groups. There were those who supported Daniel, parents, teachers, workers, who said they had always felt uneasy around the HOA but never spoke out. Then there were those who still backed Linda and the HOA, claiming it was just a misunderstanding, or that Daniel should have followed the rules. One neighbor told a reporter on camera, "I didn't know who he really was. If I had, I would have said something sooner." Another said, "We all knew Linda was strict, but we didn't think she'd go this far." Meanwhile, city officials scrambled to contain the damage. The mayor held an emergency press conference. "We are deeply disturbed by these allegations," he said, An investigation has been launched into the actions of the HOA and its leadership. Behind closed doors, the HOA board met in secret. Some wanted to apologize. Others wanted to deny everything, but Linda refused. "This isn't over," she told them. "That man embarrassed us. We're not done fighting." But no one else wanted to fight anymore. Inside the investigation, state authorities stepped in. The Department of Family and Protective Services launched an internal review of how Emily and Jake were removed from their home. They found serious flaws in the process. The caseworker hadn't verified the claims properly. No real evidence had been collected. No visits had been made to the Mercer home before taking the children. Worst of all, the report came from a private group, the HOA, not law enforcement. This case should never have gone as far as it did, the head investigator said during a press briefing. "We failed this family." Several social workers were placed on leave. The caseworker lost her license. At the same time, the police department began looking into Linda and the HOA's history. They discovered dozens of complaints from other homeowners, people who had been fined for silly things like having too many flower pots or letting their dog bark at night. Some families had even moved away because of the pressure. One elderly woman was forced to sell her home after being hit with thousands in fines for painting her fence the wrong shade of white. "It was emotional abuse," she told a reporter. "They made me feel like I didn't belong." Now, with the spotlight on them, more victims came forward. And this time, someone was listening. Daniel fights back. Daniel didn't stop with the court ruling. He hired a new team of lawyers, specialists in civil rights and government abuse cases. He filed lawsuits against the HOA, the Social Services Agency, and the City Code Enforcement Office. His message was clear. You don't get to play God with people's lives. Not in my town. Not anywhere. He also reached out to the families who had been hurt by the HOA. He offered legal help, emotional support, and a voice. At a local town hall meeting, he stood up in front of hundreds of people. "I'm not here to ruin lives," he said. "I'm here to make sure this never happens again." The crowd clapped. Some even cheered. Linda sat in the back row, stone-faced. She knew her time was up. The fall of a tyrant. Soon after, Linda Carmichael was charged with falsifying reports, misuse of authority, and conspiracy to interfere with parental rights. Her mugshot went viral. Neighbors who once feared her now laughed at her downfall. The HOA was stripped of its powers. Its bank accounts were frozen. Its website taken down. New elections were held, and a fresh group of volunteers took over, ones who actually cared about the community instead of controlling it. The old HOA sign outside the neighborhood was torn down and replaced with a simple wooden board that read, "Welcome to our home." It was a small change, but a meaningful one. A new beginning. Back at home, life slowly returned to normal. Emily and Jake started to heal. They talked more, laughed more. One evening they sat with their dad on the porch swing watching the sunset. "You okay?" Emily asked. Daniel smiled. "Yeah, I am." Jake leaned his head on his dad's shoulder. "Do you think we'll ever forget this?" "No," Daniel said softly, "but we'll grow stronger from it." Emily looked at him. "So, what's next?" Daniel stood up, stretched, and looked out at the quiet street. "Next," he said, "we start fixing what they broke. Because this wasn't just about one family, it was about justice, and Daniel Mercer was just getting started." The town was still buzzing with shock and anger. Linda Carmichael had been arrested. The HOA was shut down. Social services faced a full-scale investigation, and at the center of it all stood Daniel Mercer, father, federal judge, and now accidental hero. But even though his kids were back home, the damage ran deep. People were talking, families were healing, and justice was finally starting to catch up. The investigation grows. Within days of Linda's arrest, more secrets came out. Investigators dug through old records and found that she had been running the HOA like her own private kingdom for years. She had fined people for things like leaving Christmas lights up too long, painting their front door without permission, having too many guests at a birthday party, even complaining about how someone walked their dog. One neighbor said Linda once called animal control because a child threw a ball over the fence. She didn't care if it hurt anyone, he told a reporter. She just wanted control. As the investigation grew, so did the list of victims. Families who had quietly suffered under the HOA's rule finally spoke up. An elderly man shared how Linda forced him to pay $2,000 in fines for letting leaves pile up near his sidewalk, even though he had broken his leg and couldn't clean it himself. A single mom said she was threatened with legal action after her son played basketball in the driveway past 9 p.m. Another family moved away after being harassed for months. "We felt trapped," the mother said on camera. "We just wanted to live peacefully." Now they weren't alone anymore. Daniel became their voice. He helped them file lawsuits. He connected them with lawyers. He even gave public speeches about what happened. His message was simple. No one should have to live in fear of their neighbors. Social services under fire. The spotlight wasn't only on the HOA Child Protective Services, CPS, was also under heavy pressure. People started asking questions. How could they take a child from a parent based on a false report? Why? Didn't they visit the house first? Who made the decision to place Emily and Jake in foster care? Inside the agency, things were falling apart. The caseworker who handled the Mercers case was suspended. Her supervisor resigned. The head of CPS in the county held a press conference. "We made a terrible mistake," she admitted. "We failed this family. We failed all families." She announced new rules. No more removing children based solely on HOA complaints. All cases must include a home visit before removal. Parents will be contacted immediately if there's a concern. It was a small step, but an important one. Still, many asked how many other families had been wrongly targeted. Linda's day in court. Weeks later, Linda Carmichael stood in court again, but this time not as a neighborhood leader. She was charged with falsifying reports, abuse of power, conspiracy to interfere with parental rights, harassment, fraud. The courtroom was packed. Victims sat in the audience. News cameras rolled. Reporters scribbled notes. Daniel sat calmly beside his lawyer. Linda looked tired, defeated. Her lawyer tried to argue that she was just trying to protect the community. Judge Harper cut him off. "This wasn't protection," the judge said. "This was bullying masked as authority." The trial lasted 5 days. Witnesses took the stand. Neighbors told their stories. Evidence was shown. Finally, the jury reached a verdict, guilty on all counts. Linda was sentenced to 3 years in jail. She would serve time, not for kidnapping, but for abusing her power and lying to the law. As she was led out in handcuffs, someone in the crowd whispered, "Justice is finally here." The town begins to heal. With Linda gone, the town slowly began to heal. New leaders were elected to run the neighborhood. They promised openness, fairness, and kindness. They removed the last sign of the old HOA from the entrance of the neighborhood. In its place, they put up a new sign that read, "Welcome home. Respect each other." Neighbors started talking, again, smiling, inviting each other over. For the first time in years, the streets felt peaceful. Emily and Jake noticed the change too. Kids played outside again. People waved when they passed by. One evening, Emily turned to her dad and said, "Do you think we'll ever forget this?" Daniel thought for a moment. "No," he said. "But maybe that's a good thing." Jake frowned. "Why?" "Because remembering helps us make sure it never happens again." Daniel becomes a voice for others. After everything, Daniel didn't stop fighting. He went on TV and talked about the dangers of unchecked power. "I've seen criminals in courtrooms," he said during an interview, "but nothing scared me more than watching my own kids taken by lies." He met with lawmakers and pushed for changes in HOA laws across the country. He helped pass a new rule. HOAs can no longer report families to social services without real evidence. He also created a support group for families who had been targeted. "We're not just survivors," he told them. "We're fighters, and we're going to make sure no one else goes through what we did." A quiet life again. Back home, life slowly returned to normal. Daniel cooked dinner most nights. The kids did their homework. They laughed together again. One afternoon, Jake looked at his dad and asked, "Do you miss being a regular guy?" Daniel smiled. "Sometimes," he said. "But I don't regret standing up for us." Emily hugged him. "You're the strongest person I know." Daniel kissed the top of her head. "You both are," he said softly. Outside, the sun was setting. Birds chirped. The wind gently blew through the trees. And for the first time in a long time, everything felt okay. The town had changed. People were kinder. Neighbors talked again. And for the first time in years, no one feared the HOA. But Daniel Mercer knew his fight wasn't over. What happened to him and his kids could happen to anyone, anywhere, and he was going to make sure it didn't. Daniel takes his story. National. Weeks after Linda Carmichael was sent to jail, Daniel got a call from a national news show. They wanted to feature his story. At first, he said no. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to raise his kids in peace. But then he thought about all the other families who had been hurt by power-hungry HOAs. He thought about the elderly man fined for leaves on his lawn, the single mom threatened with legal action over her son playing basketball, the family forced to sell their home because of something as small as a fence color. So he agreed. The interview aired on national TV. Millions watched. Reporters asked him how it felt to have your children taken because of a petty neighborhood rule. "I'll never forget walking into my house and finding it empty," Daniel said. "That moment will haunt me forever." He told them what really happened, how an HOA used lies to destroy a family, how social services believed those lies without proof, and how one person with authority abused her power until innocent lives were ruined. When the segment ended, the phone lines lit up. People across the country started sharing their own stories. Some had been fined thousands of dollars for silly rules. Others had been harassed for years. And some had even lost their homes. One woman wrote online, "I cried. Watching this. I've lived this nightmare. Thank you for speaking out." Another message read, "You gave us hope. Now we know we're not alone." Daniel realized something powerful. His voice mattered, and now he was using it. Congress hears his voice. Soon after the interview, Daniel received another call. This time from Washington, D.C. Lawmakers had seen his story. They invited him to testify before Congress. The topic? HOA abuse and parental rights. It was a big step. Daniel stood in front of a room full of politicians, reporters, and lawyers. He looked around and remembered the courtroom where he once wore the black robe. Not as a father fighting for his kids, but as a judge deciding the fate of others. Now, he was here for something bigger. He cleared his throat and began. "My name is Judge Daniel Mercer. I am a U.S. District Court judge, and I am also a father. He paused. And I almost lost my children because of a broken system. He told them everything, from the first warning letter to the false report that took Emily and Jake away. He showed them proof, photos of fines for nothing, emails filled with threats, videos of Linda Carmichael controlling people like puppets. He even shared letters from other victims, people who had never spoken out before. When he finished, there was silence. Then applause. Not loud, not flashy, but real, respectful, and it meant more than any standing ovation ever could. New laws are born. After the hearing, lawmakers worked fast. Within months, new laws were passed. In Texas, HOAs can no longer report families to child services without real evidence. Fines must be reasonable and based on actual violations. Parents have the right to challenge HOA decisions in court. Across the country, more states began reviewing their HOA laws. Some banned HOAs from contacting law enforcement or child services unless there is clear danger. Others created hotlines where people could report HOA abuse anonymously. Daniel helped write parts of these laws. He met with governors, spoke at conferences, even helped train social workers on how to spot fake reports. He became known as the judge who fought back, and he didn't stop there. A new mission. Daniel started a nonprofit called Neighbors United. Its goal: to help families targeted by abusive HOAs. He hired lawyers, set up free legal clinics, created support groups for parents who had been unfairly punished. He even opened a hotline where people could call and share their stories. Every week, hundreds reached out. Some needed help fighting fines. Others had been wrongly accused of neglect. Many just needed someone to listen. And Daniel made sure they were heard. Back home again. Despite all the changes, Daniel still loved his quiet life. He still cooked dinner most nights, still drove his kids to school, still walked the dog every morning. But now when neighbors saw him, they smiled, they waved. Sometimes they thanked him. "You changed things for all of us," one neighbor said. Daniel always replied the same way: "We did it together." Emily and Jake grew stronger too. They went back to school, played video games, laughed with friends, but they also learned something important. That courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing the right thing, even when you're scared. One night, Jake sat next to his dad on the couch. "Do you think we'll ever forget what happened?" he asked. Daniel looked at him. "No," he said. "But maybe that's a good thing." Jake tilted his head. "How?" "Because remembering helps us protect others," Daniel said. "And that's what we're doing now." A final word. Years later, Daniel stood in front of a crowd at a community event. He looked out at the faces of people who had once been afraid. Now they were strong. Now they were free. He raised the microphone. "This story started with pain," he said. "With fear. With lies." He paused. "But it ends with something better." He smiled. "It ends with truth. And justice. And love." The crowd clapped. Children played nearby. Birds chirped. And for the first time in a long time, everything was okay.